Welcome to Void Case Files. Before we dive into tonight's investigation, I want to share something with you. 94.7% of the people watching this right now aren't subscribed. If these deep dives into the unexplained speak to you, hit that subscribe button. We're pushing for 1,000 subscribers by New Year's, and we're currently at 676. With daily videos and your support, we can get there together. Now picture this. March 16th, 2016. High noon on the Massachusetts Turnpike near Charlton. Trooper Thomas Clardy, a decorated Marine veteran and father of 6, pulls over a speeding vehicle. It's routine. Something he's done 1,000 times before. Minutes later, his cruiser is violently struck from behind. The impact sends his vehicle careening down an embankment. Trooper Clardy dies at the hospital. The official story? A tragic accident. A drug driver. Case closed. But what if I told you this exact spot has been claiming lives for centuries? What if I told you that mile marker 80 on the Massachusetts Turnpike sits on ground so cursed, so steeped in blood and broken promises, that even the dead can't leave? Tonight, we're investigating a stretch of highway where the boundary between our world and something else has worn dangerously thin. This is the story of what really haunts Highway 90. And I promise you, by the end of this investigation, you'll never look at a midnight drive the same way again. Thomas L. Clardy was 44 years old on the day he died. An 11-year veteran of the Massachusetts State Police, he'd served his country before that in both the Army and Marine Corps. The kind of man who showed up, did the work, and went home to his family, his wife Risa. Their 6 children, Tyler, Lily, Gabriella, Emma, Eva, and Noah. Those who knew Clardy describe him as steady, reliable, the type of officer you'd want responding to your emergency. He'd joined the state police in 2005, fresh from military service, and had been assigned to the Charlton Barracks since 2012. 3 years patrolling the same stretch of highway, 3 years driving past mile marker 80 multiple times every shift. He knew this road, knew its curves and exits, knew where speeders like to push their luck, and where fog rolled in thick on autumn mornings. He knew the spots where deer crossed at dusk and where black ice formed on winter nights. This was his road. March 16th, 2016 was a Wednesday. Clear skies, temperature in the mid-50s, perfect visibility. Spring was just beginning to touch the edges of the forest that lined the highway. Clardy was working an overtime shift, the kind experienced troopers volunteer for. Accident reduction enforcement, making the highways safer. His shift had started at 11 that morning. By 11:30, he'd already conducted 2 traffic stops, both for speeding. Both had ended with warnings. Clardy wasn't the type to write tickets unless absolutely necessary. He believed in giving people a chance to do better. At 11:47 that morning, he pulled over a black Chevy Tahoe for speeding near mile marker 80, just past the Charlton Service Plaza. His dashboard camera captured everything. The footage would later be reviewed frame by investigators, played in court, watched by his family searching for answers in his final moments. The video shows Clardy activating his lights, pulling in behind the Tahoe, radioing in his position. He approaches the vehicle with his usual professional demeanor, checks the driver's license and registration, has a brief conversation with the driver, issues a warning, returns to his cruiser to complete the paperwork. He settles into his seat, picks up his clipboard, begins filling out the form. It's 11:52 now, 5 minutes since the initial stop. Everything is routine. Everything is normal. That's when witnesses in other vehicles saw the silver Nissan Maxima. It was in the far left lane, travelling at what multiple drivers would later estimate as 70 to 80 miles per hour. Then, without warning, without any sign of braking, it began crossing lanes. One witness driving a delivery truck would later testify that the Maxima moved like it was on rails, just cutting straight across without any hesitation. Another driver said it looked like the car was being pulled by something. The Maxima crossed 3 lanes of traffic and struck Clardy's cruiser from behind with devastating force. The impact was so severe that Clardy's SUV was launched off the highway and down a steep embankment. The vehicle rolled multiple times before coming to rest at the bottom, mangled almost beyond recognition. Other drivers immediately called 911. Several pulled over and ran to help. The first to reach the wreckage was a registered nurse who happened to be passing by. She climbed down the embankment without hesitation, her medical training overriding any concern for her own safety. What she found would haunt her for years. Clardy was still alive, but critically injured. She held his hand and talked to him, keeping him conscious, while sirens grew louder in the distance. She told him help was coming. She told him to hold on. She told him his family was waiting for him. First responders arrived within 4 minutes. Firefighters worked quickly to extract Clardy from the wreckage. Paramedics stabilized him as best they could. He was rushed to UMass Memorial Medical Center in Worcester, where a trauma team was already standing by. But the injuries were too severe. Trooper Thomas Clardy was pronounced dead at 1:37 that afternoon. 2 hours after a routine traffic stop. 2 hours after what should have been just another Wednesday. The driver of the Maxima was 30-year-old David Njuguna of Webster, Massachusetts. He survived with serious injuries, including a broken leg, fractured ribs, and a severe concussion. He was transported to the same hospital where Clardy had been taken, placed under guard pending investigation. The Massachusetts State Police immediately launched a full investigation. The collision analysis and reconstruction section was called in. Investigators photographed every inch of the scene. They measured skid marks, or rather the lack of them. They documented the point of impact, the debris field, the final resting positions of both vehicles. What they found was troubling. There were no skid marks from the Maxima. None. David Njuguna had never touched his brakes. His vehicle had accelerated before impact, not slowed down. The data from the car's computer confirmed this. In the seconds before the crash, the Maxima had been traveling at 78 miles per hour. Toxicology tests revealed marijuana in Njuguna's system. Witness testimony from drivers who'd been near him on the highway told a consistent story. He'd been driving erratically for at least 7 or 8 minutes before the crash, weaving between lanes, tailgating other vehicles, making aggressive passes. One witness, an off-duty police officer from Connecticut, had actually considered calling 911 about Njuguna's driving, but hadn't gotten the chance before the crash occurred. He testified that Njuguna's driving was the most reckless behavior I'd seen on a highway in 20 years of law enforcement. Njuguna's defense attorneys argued that he'd suffered a medical emergency, possibly a seizure, that caused him to lose control of his vehicle. They brought in medical experts who testified about the possibility of undiagnosed epilepsy. They suggested that Njuguna had blacked out, that he had no memory of the crash because he'd been unconscious. But prosecutors presented a different narrative. They showed the court evidence of Njuguna's continuous reckless driving in the minutes leading up to the crash. They argued that this wasn't a sudden medical emergency, but rather a pattern of dangerous behavior that culminated in tragedy. The case went to trial in 2019, 3 years after Clardy's death. The courtroom was packed every day with state police officers in dress uniform, Clardy's family and friends, and members of the community who wanted to see justice served. On the day of the verdict, more than 50 state police troopers lined up outside the courthouse. When the Clardy family arrived, the troopers stood at attention and saluted. It was a moment of profound respect and solidarity, a reminder that when one trooper falls, the entire force feels the loss. Judge Janet Kenton. Walker found David Njuguna guilty of involuntary manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, driving an uninsured vehicle, and driving to endanger. She sentenced him to 5 to 7 years in prison. At the sentencing hearing, Racer Clardy stood before the court. She'd prepared a victim impact statement, words she'd written and rewritten, trying to capture the magnitude of what had been taken from her and her children. "The day I was told my husband was killed is the day my life stood still," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "The emotional, mental, and physical toll from the loss of my husband stays with us every day. It will continue with us for the rest of our lives. Our children have gone through a loss no child should ever have to endure. They lost their father, their hero, the man who taught them right from wrong, who coached their sports teams, who tucked them in at night." She looked directly at Njuguna. "My husband was doing his job. He was making the roads safer for everyone, including you. And you took him from us. You took him from his children who needed him. You took him from all the people he would have helped in the years to come. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Njuguna served 6 years. With credit for time served while awaiting trial, he was released in April 2022, 6 years for a life lost. When news of his release reached the Clardy family, Racer issued a brief statement. "We are disappointed in the system and extremely sad that my husband lost his life, and the man who took it served only 6 years. 6 years for a life lost. There's no justice in that." That's the story the news told. A tragedy caused by a reckless, impaired driver, a family destroyed, a brief prison sentence that seemed inadequate to the crime. Case closed. But here's what they didn't tell you. Here's what they couldn't tell you, because how do you report something that defies explanation? Mile marker 80 sits on land that has been feared for over 300 years. Long before there was a highway, before there were cars or electric lights or any trappings of modern civilization, there was forest. Dense, ancient forest that stretched for miles in every direction. The Nipmuc people knew these woods intimately. They knew which paths were safe and which were forbidden. They knew where to hunt and where to avoid. And they knew that certain places held power, places where the natural world and the spirit world touched. One of those places is where mile marker 80 now stands. The Nipmuc called it by a name that has been lost to time, but elders who still remember the old stories translate it roughly as the crossing place, or where they pass through. It was considered a thin place, somewhere the boundary between the living and the dead was permeable. It wasn't evil necessarily, but it was dangerous. It required respect. The tribe would leave offerings there, small things, tobacco, corn, wampum beads, not as worship, but as acknowledgement, as payment for safe passage through lands that weren't entirely theirs, that belonged also to those who had come before. When the first European colonists arrived in the mid-1600s, they didn't understand these traditions. They saw the offerings as evidence of savage superstition. They ignored the warnings of the native people who told them certain places should be left alone. By 1675, tensions between the colonists and the native tribes had reached a breaking point. King Philip's War erupted, and it would become one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. Nearly 3% of the English colonist population was killed. Between 70 and 80% of the Native American population was wiped out. The fighting was brutal, merciless. Both sides committed atrocities. Villages were burned. Families were slaughtered. The line between soldier and civilian meant nothing. Everyone was a target. In March 1676, a Nipmuc war party was moving through the forest near what is now Charlton. They knew the area well. They'd been using it as a base for raids on colonial settlements. The forest was thick enough to hide their movements, and there were dozens of paths that only the Nipmuc knew. Colonial militia, tipped off by a native informant, set up an ambush. They waited in the pre-dawn darkness, muskets loaded, patience wearing thin as the hours passed. Some of the militiamen were farmers who'd lost their homes to raids. Some had watched their families killed. They wanted revenge. When the Nipmuc warriors appeared, moving quietly through the trees, the militia opened fire. The volley caught the war party completely by surprise. Men fell instantly, killed before they even understood they were under attack. Others tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The battle, if you could call it that, lasted less than 20 minutes. When the gunfire stopped, between 40 and 60 Nipmuc warriors lay dead or dying. The militia suffered only 3 casualties. What happened next depends on whose account you believe. Colonial records claim the militia buried the native dead in a mass grave and said prayers over them, treating them with the respect due to fallen enemies. Nipmuc oral history tells a different story. According to the tribal elders, the colonial forces were furious that they hadn't captured any warriors alive for public execution. In their anger, they left the bodies where they fell as a warning to other tribes. No burial, no ceremony, just corpses left to rot in the forest. James Strongbow, a member of the Nipmuc Nation, shared with me what his grandfather had told him. The warriors who died that day never found rest. Their spirits couldn't move on because the proper rites were never performed, and because they died on a thin place, a crossing place, they became trapped between worlds. But the story doesn't end there. According to tribal tradition, a medicine woman named Nashoba learned of the massacre. She travelled to the site and found the bodies still lying in the forest, being picked over by scavengers. In her grief and rage, she performed a ceremony. Not to lay the spirits to rest, because she didn't have the authority or the tools to do that properly. Instead, she cursed the ground. The exact words have been lost, filtered through generations and translations, but the meaning is clear. Those who trespass where the dead lie restless will find their paths twisted, their journey ended where ours did. For the next 2.5 centuries, the forest remained largely untouched. A few colonists ventured into these woods, but most found reasons to avoid the area. There were rumours, stories of people who went into the forest and came out changed, if they came out at all. Reports of hearing drums in the night, seeing figures moving between the trees that vanished when you looked directly at them, feeling eyes watching from the shadows. Local historians documented some of these accounts. In 1734, a surveyor named Josiah Blackwell wrote in his journal, "Attempted to map the western forest today. The men refused to continue past the old massacre ground. They claimed to hear voices in a heathen tongue. I confess the place unsettles me as well. We shall find another route." In 1802, a minister travelling through the area wrote, "Spent the night in these woods out of necessity, though the local inhabitants warned against it. I witnessed lights moving between the trees, though I could find no source. My horse was terrified and nearly threw me twice. I shall not pass this way again." In 1889, a timber company attempted to harvest lumber from the forest. The operation lasted 3 weeks before being abandoned. Company records indicate that workers refused to continue, citing unnatural occurrences and hostile presences. 7 men quit in a single day after one of their crew disappeared for 6 hours, later found wandering in a daze with no memory of where he'd been. Then came progress. Then came the highway. In the early 1950s, Massachusetts was growing rapidly. The post-war boom meant more cars, more commerce, more need for infrastructure. The state decided to build a turnpike connecting Boston to the western part of the state. It would be a modern marvel, cutting travel time in half, boosting the economy, connecting communities. The route planners drew a line on the map that went straight through Charlton, straight through the cursed ground. Nobody consulted the Nipmuc. Nobody checked the local folklore. The engineers saw empty forest and called it an opportunity. Construction began in 1955. The crews were experienced, having worked on other major highway projects across New England. This should have been routine. Grade the land, lay the foundation, pour the asphalt, move on to the next section. But Section 7, the area that would become mile marker 80, proved difficult from the start. The construction foreman was a man named Arthur Donnelly, a 30-year veteran who'd worked on everything from the New Jersey Turnpike to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. He'd seen it all. Nothing rattled him until Charlton. In his daily logs archived at the Charlton Historical Society, Donnelly documented problems that seemed minor at first but grew increasingly strange. Equipment breakdowns, unexplained delays, workers calling in sick in unusually high numbers. Then, in August 1956, came this entry. Crew refuses to work in Section 7. Found remains while excavating. Old remains. Not sure how old. Bones are dark, nearly black with age. They're everywhere once you start digging. Site supervisor called in the county coroner, but he says they're too old for his jurisdiction. Historical Society shows no interest. Men say they hear drums at night. 3 quit today. Need to bring in new crew from Boston. The remains were Native American, that much was clear. But this was 1956. There were no laws protecting native burial grounds. No requirement for archaeological surveys. The economic pressure to complete the highway on time and on budget was immense. A decision was made at the state level. The remains would be quietly relocated to a location that would later become a small memorial park near the town centre. Work would continue, except they didn't relocate all of them. They couldn't. The burial site was far larger than anyone had anticipated. There weren't just a few graves. There were dozens, possibly hundreds. Some from the massacre in 1676, others far older from when the Nipmuc had used this area for ceremonial purposes. The new crew from Boston lasted 2 weeks. Then they also began reporting strange occurrences. Tools would go missing and turn up in impossible locations. Heavy equipment would start on its own in the middle of the night. Men reported seeing figures in the trees watching them work. One night, a security guard stationed at the site radioed in a panic. He said he could see fires in the forest, dozens of them, arranged in a circle. When other guards arrived, there were no fires, no evidence of any burning. But the guard insisted he'd seen them, that he'd heard chanting coming from the direction of the lights. He quit the next morning and refused to discuss what he'd seen. Arthur Donnelly, pragmatic and determined, pushed the crew to work faster. He wanted Section 7 finished so they could move on. In his personal diary, not the official logs, he wrote, "This place is wrong. Can't explain it better than that. Men feel it. I feel it. But we have a job to do. Once this section is paved, whatever's here will be buried for good. We just need to finish." They finished in October 1956. The asphalt was laid, the lines were painted, mile marker 80 was installed, Section 7 was complete, but whatever was there wasn't buried. It was just hidden beneath a thin layer of modern civilization, waiting. The Massachusetts Turnpike officially opened in 1957. It was celebrated as an engineering triumph, a symbol of progress. Governor Foster Facolo cut the ribbon at a ceremony attended by hundreds of people. The highway would transform the state, connect east to west, bring prosperity to every town along its route. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. Traffic flowed smoothly. Drivers marveled at how quickly they could now make the trip from Boston to Springfield. Businesses along the route saw an immediate boost. The Turnpike was declared a success. Then came the first accident. It was June 1957, just 3 months after the highway opened. A driver named Robert Chen was heading eastbound in his 1955 Chevrolet, traveling home to Boston after visiting family in Springfield. It was mid-afternoon, clear weather, light traffic. As he approached mile marker 80, his car suddenly veered across all lanes and crashed into the median. Other drivers stopped to help. Chen was shaken but uninjured. When state police arrived and asked what happened, Chen's explanation made no sense. "The wheel turned itself," he said. "I was just driving, hands at 10 and 2 like I've done for 20 years, and suddenly the wheel just turned. I tried to correct, but it was like something else was controlling it. Like something grabbed the wheel and pulled." Investigators examined the vehicle thoroughly. There was no mechanical failure. The steering system was intact. Chen hadn't been drinking. He had no medical conditions. He was a safe driver with a clean record. There was simply no explanation for why his car had crossed 3 lanes and crashed. The incident was filed as driver error and forgotten, but it wasn't an isolated event. Over the next decade, similar accidents occurred with disturbing regularity, always in the same area, always involving vehicles that suddenly crossed multiple lanes without apparent reason, always with drivers who claimed they'd lost control, that something had forced their vehicles off course. Then came the disappearances. In 1968, on a warm summer evening, a young couple named David and Linda Morrison were driving home to Worcester. They'd been visiting friends in Springfield and were making good time on the Turnpike. At 9:47 p.m, they called their roommate from a payphone at the Charlton Service Plaza to say they'd be home in about 45 minutes. They never arrived. At 2:30 in the morning, a state police trooper found their car parked on the shoulder near mile marker 79. The engine was still running. The headlights were on. Both doors were standing open. Their wallets, Linda's purse, and the overnight bags they'd packed for the trip were all in the vehicle. The keys were still in the ignition. David and Linda were nowhere to be found. A massive search was launched at dawn. Hundreds of volunteers combed the forest on both sides of the highway. Search dogs tracked the couple's scent from the car but lost it after about 30 yards, as if David and Linda had simply vanished into thin air. 2 days later, a farmer found them walking along Route 20, a rural road about 7 miles from where their car had been discovered. They were disoriented, dehydrated, and confused. Neither had any memory of the past 2 days. David kept saying, "We just stopped for a minute. We just stopped." Linda couldn't explain where they'd been or how they'd gotten so far from their car. Medical examinations found no evidence of drugs or trauma. The case was filed as unexplained, and the Morrisons eventually moved out of state, refusing to discuss what happened. But their daughter, years later, shared something she'd never told investigators. Her mother had nightmares for the rest of her life. Always the same dream. A tall shadow figure standing beside their car, tapping on the window, gesturing for them to follow him into the woods. And in the dream, they would always obey. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the reports continued. State police logs from this era, now archived and available through public records requests, show a consistent pattern of incidents near mile marker 80. In 1973, a toll booth operator named Margaret Sullivan reported seeing shadow people crossing the highway late at night. She described them as humanoid figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, moving across the lanes without regard for traffic. When vehicles approached, the figures would simply vanish. Sullivan filed multiple reports about these sightings. Her supervisors initially took her seriously, but when other toll operators didn't corroborate her accounts, the reports were quietly dismissed. Sullivan was eventually transferred to a different location. In a letter to a friend preserved in her personal papers, she wrote, "They think I'm crazy. Maybe I am, but I know what I saw. There's something wrong with that stretch of road, something that shouldn't be there." In 1978, a state police dispatcher received a strange call at 3:15 in the morning. A driver, extremely agitated, reported that he'd just passed a police cruiser parked on the shoulder near mile marker 80 with its lights flashing. When he'd slowed down to see if the officer needed assistance, he'd seen that the cruiser was empty. Engine running, lights on, no trooper anywhere in sight. When units responded to check it out, they found nothing. No cruiser, no evidence that any vehicle had been parked there recently. The driver who'd called it in was adamant about what he'd seen, but without any physical evidence, the report was filed as a possible hallucination or misidentification. In 1981, state police received multiple reports over a 2-week period of a dark figure standing in the road near mile marker 80. The calls came from different drivers on different nights, people who didn't know each other. All described the same thing, a tall, motionless figure standing in the travel lane. When drivers slowed down or stopped, the figure would vanish. Troopers patrolled the area extensively during this period. They never found anyone, but the calls kept coming. Retired Trooper William Kerrigan, who worked that section during the early 1980s, shared his experiences with me. We all knew something was off about that area. Guys would joke about it, say it was haunted, but there was an edge to the jokes. Nobody really wanted to patrol there alone at night. Not because we were scared exactly, but because weird things happened. Your radio would cut out for no reason. You'd see lights in the woods. You'd feel like you were being watched. He paused. The brass didn't want us talking about it. Bad for morale, they said, bad for public confidence, so we kept it quiet. But we knew. We all knew. Then came October 12th, 1989, and everything changed. That was the night Trooper Daniel Hayes vanished, and the unofficial silence surrounding mile marker 80 could no longer be maintained. Daniel Hayes was 38 years old. He'd been a state police trooper for 12 years, long enough to have worked every shift, every weather condition, every kind of call you can imagine. He was professional, experienced, not the type to make mistakes or take unnecessary risks. On the night of October 12th, Hayes was assigned to a late shift covering the Charlton area. It had been a quiet evening, light traffic, no major incidents. At 10:43 p.m, he radioed dispatch to report heavy fog developing near mile marker 79. He said he was going to conduct a patrol through the area to make sure visibility wasn't causing any problems for drivers. "Dispatch, Unit 227, Hayes' voice came through clear on the recording. "I've got heavy fog rolling in near marker 79. Going to do a slow pass, make sure everyone's taking it easy." "Copy that. 227, the dispatcher responded. "Check back in 15. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The dispatcher tried to raise Hayes on the radio. No response. This was unusual. Hayes was reliable about radio check-ins. The dispatcher tried again. Still nothing. At 11:20 p.m, another trooper, Unit 231, was asked to check on Hayes' last known location. Unit 231 found Hayes' cruiser parked on the shoulder near mile marker 80. The engine was running. All the lights were on, emergency lights flashing, headlights illuminating the fog-shrouded road ahead. The driver's door was standing wide open. Unit 231 approached cautiously, calling out Hayes' name. No response. He checked inside the vehicle. Hayes' hat was on the passenger seat, placed there carefully, not thrown. His service weapon was still in its holster, secured to the seatbelt. There was a cup of coffee in the cup holder, still warm. The radio was on, volume turned all the way up as if Hayes had been straining to hear something through heavy static. Everything suggested Hayes had just stepped out of the vehicle moments ago, but he was nowhere to be seen. Unit 231 immediately called for backup. Within 20 minutes, 6 state police cruisers were on scene. Troopers searched the immediate area, calling Hayes' name, sweeping flashlights across the fog-shrouded grass and trees. One trooper noticed footprints in the grass. The heavy dew that night made them clearly visible. They led away from the driver's side of the cruiser, headed perpendicular to the highway toward the tree line. The stride length and pattern were consistent with someone walking normally, not running, not being dragged. The troopers followed the prints. They went 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet. At exactly 42 feet from the cruiser, the footprints stopped, not faded, not disturbed. They simply ended, as if Daniel Hayes had been plucked from the earth mid-stride and carried away. The troopers stood there in the fog, flashlights illuminating the last footprint, and nobody said anything for a long moment. Then one of them radioed for more units. This wasn't just a missing officer anymore. This was something they couldn't explain. By midnight, the scene had expanded into a full-scale search and rescue operation. State police from across the region responded. Local police departments sent officers. Firefighters arrived with specialized equipment. A K-9 unit was brought in from Boston. The search continued through the night and into the morning. As the fog lifted with the sunrise, helicopters joined the effort, equipped with thermal imaging cameras that could detect body heat from hundreds of feet away. Dozens of volunteers from the community showed up to help search the forest. The K-9 unit tracked Hayes' scent from his cruiser to the exact spot where his footprints ended. Then the dogs did something their handlers had never seen before. All 3 dogs, trained and experienced animals who'd worked dozens of searches, suddenly became agitated. They pulled back toward the road, whining, showing clear signs of fear. One dog actually cowered, pressing itself against its handler's legs. The lead K-9 handler, a man named Thomas Braddock with 22 years of experience, tried to get his dog to continue. The animal refused. When Braddock tried to physically guide the dog forward, it let out a sound he'd never heard from it before, somewhere between a whine and a howl. "In all my years working with dogs," Braddock said in his report, "I've never seen terror like that. These animals are trained to work in dangerous situations. They've tracked armed suspects, worked in collapsed buildings, searched disaster sites. But something at that spot scared them badly." The search continued for 3 days. They covered miles of forest in every direction. They searched abandoned buildings, checked remote areas, followed up every possible lead. Nothing was found. No trace of Daniel Hayes, no clothing, no blood, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist the moment his footprints ended. After a week, the active search was scaled back. After a month, it was officially suspended. After 6 months, Daniel Hayes was declared missing, presumed dead. His case file remained open but inactive. His family held a memorial service without a body to bury. His fellow troopers attended in dress uniform, standing at attention as his wife and 3 children tried to make sense of a loss that had no explanation. The state police honored him with full recognition of his service and sacrifice. But for the troopers who'd been there that night, who'd stood at the spot where his footprints ended, the case was far from closed. They had questions that couldn't be answered through investigation or evidence, questions that kept them awake at night. 3 troopers who participated in the initial search independently filed supplementary reports days after Hayes' disappearance. The reports were nearly identical, which made them all the more disturbing because the troopers hadn't discussed what they'd seen with each other. All 3 described seeing a dark shape moving through the trees during the search. Not an animal, not another searcher. Something else. They described it as a void, a patch of darkness that was somehow darker than the surrounding night. It moved between the trees with an unnatural fluidity, and when flashlight beams hit it, the light seemed to be absorbed rather than reflected. These reports were filed and quickly classified. They didn't appear in any public documentation of the search. The official story was that Trooper Daniel Hayes had vanished without a trace, and the case remained under investigation. But among the state police, particularly those who worked the Charlton area, the story took on a different character. Hayes had been taken. By what, nobody could say. But something at mile marker 80 had reached out and claimed him. After Hayes's disappearance, subtle changes were implemented. Nothing official, nothing documented in policy manuals. Just quiet adjustments that suggested command knew something was wrong with that stretch of road. Single officer patrols after 10 p.m. between mile markers 78 and 82 became rare. Officers were encouraged to work in pairs in that area, though the official reason given was increased safety protocols. Radio check-ins became more frequent. Troopers were told to report their exact location every 10 minutes when in that zone, rather than the standard 30-minute check-ins used elsewhere. And there was an unwritten rule, passed from veteran officers to rookies. If you have to stop at mile marker 80, keep your engine running, your doors locked, and don't leave your vehicle unless absolutely necessary. Don't go into the woods, don't investigate strange lights or sounds. Call for backup and wait. Nobody explained why these precautions were necessary. They didn't have to. The veterans who'd been there the night Hayes vanished understood, and they made sure the younger troopers understood too, even if they couldn't say exactly what they were being protected from. The incidents didn't stop with Hayes's disappearance. If anything, they increased. November 1993. A long-haul trucker named Robert Big Rob Patterson was making a run from Buffalo to Boston. It was 2:30 in the morning, and he'd been driving for 6 hours. He was tired but alert, sipping coffee, listening to talk radio to keep himself awake. Near mile marker 81, he saw something in his headlights, a tractor-trailer rig parked on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing. Big Rob slowed down, planning to check if the driver needed assistance. That's the trucker code. You help each other out on the road. As he pulled up behind the parked truck, he noticed the door was open. He grabbed his flashlight, climbed down from his cab, and walked toward the other rig. "Hey, you need a hand?" he called out. No response. He reached the truck and looked inside. The cab was empty, but the engine was still running. There was a partially eaten sandwich on the dashboard, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder. The driver's logbook was open to today's date, the last entry made just 15 minutes ago. Big Rob walked around the truck checking for signs of the driver. Maybe he'd gone into the woods to relieve himself. Maybe he was checking something on the trailer, but there was no one around. He went back to his own truck and used his CB radio to call for help. When state police arrived 20 minutes later, they found Big Rob's rig, but no sign of the truck he'd reported. They searched the area thoroughly. No abandoned truck, no tire tracks indicating a large vehicle had been parked there recently. The driver Big Rob had described, a man named Leonard Walsh from Ohio, was reported missing by his trucking company when he failed to arrive at his destination. His rig was found 3 days later in the parking lot of a rest stop 30 miles away. The engine was cold, the keys were in the ignition, Walsh's personal belongings were inside. He was never found. When investigators questioned Big Rob, he was adamant about what he'd seen. He'd been a trucker for 18 years. He knew the difference between reality and highway hypnosis. He'd seen an abandoned truck near mile marker 81, and then it had vanished. The investigators filed his statement, but couldn't explain it. July 1998. A family of 4 was making the drive from western Massachusetts to Boston. The Hendersons, parents Michael and Sarah, their 10-year-old son Tyler, and their 6-year-old daughter Emma. They stopped at the Charlton Service Plaza around 8:30 p.m. for a bathroom break and to let the kids stretch their legs. Security footage from the Service Plaza shows the family entering the building at 8:34 p.m. It shows them exiting at 8:52 p.m. and walking back to their Honda Odyssey in the parking lot. Michael is carrying Emma on his shoulders. Sarah and Tyler are walking together, the boy eating an ice cream cone. They get in the vehicle. The footage shows the minivan's brake lights as Michael starts the engine, and then the vehicle drives away, exiting the service plaza and merging back onto the Turnpike. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Henderson family for the next 3 hours. When they failed to arrive at their destination in Boston by midnight, Michael's brother called the police. The family should have arrived by 10 p.m. at the latest. The drive from Charlton to Boston was only about 50 miles, an hour in normal traffic. State police began searching. At 1:45 a.m., a trooper spotted 4 people walking along Route 20, a rural 2-lane road about 7 miles from the Turnpike. It was the Henderson family. They were disoriented and confused. Michael kept saying, "We just stopped for a minute. We just stopped." Sarah was crying, unable to explain where they'd been. Tyler was eerily quiet, staring at nothing. Emma was asleep in Michael's arms. Their minivan was found the next morning in the parking lot of an abandoned gas station near Route 20. The keys were in the ignition. Their bags were still in the back. There was no apparent reason why they would have left the highway or abandoned their vehicle. Medical examinations found no evidence of drugs or physical trauma. The family appeared to be suffering from some form of dissociative amnesia. They had no memory of the 3 missing hours or how they'd ended up 7 miles from the Turnpike on foot. A week later, Emma began having nightmares. She would wake up screaming about the shadow man. Sarah took her to a child psychologist, hoping to help her daughter process whatever trauma she'd experienced, even if they couldn't identify what that trauma was. During a session, the psychologist asked Emma to draw what she saw in her nightmares. Emma drew a tall, thin figure that was completely black. No features, no details, just a dark shape. Next to the figure, she drew what was clearly meant to be a car and 4 stick figures representing her family. "The shadow man wanted us to follow him," Emma told the psychologist. "He said we belonged with him. He said we'd been on his road, but Daddy said no. Daddy said we had to go home. The shadow man was angry." The psychologist's report noted that Emma seemed to genuinely believe this encounter had happened, though she acknowledged it might be a false memory or a dream the child had confused with reality. The family moved to Vermont 6 months later. They never drove through Charlton again. March 2001. A state police trooper named Anthony Russo was on patrol near mile marker 78 around 2:45 in the morning. It was a quiet night, cold but clear. No traffic to speak of. Russo pulled onto the shoulder to check some paperwork. He radioed in his position and settled in to complete his reports. 10 minutes later, according to his own account, he decided to check the tree line near his position because he thought he'd heard something. He later couldn't explain what he'd heard or why he felt compelled to investigate. He left his cruiser and walked toward the woods. 20 minutes passed. Another trooper, monitoring the radio, noticed that Russo hadn't checked back in and called his unit. No response. The trooper drove to Russo's last known position and found his cruiser parked on the shoulder, engine running, door open. He was about to call in a potential missing officer when Russo emerged from the woods. He was disoriented, couldn't immediately explain where he'd been or what he'd been doing. He kept saying he needed to check something, but he couldn't remember what. Russo was taken to the hospital as a precaution. Medical examinations found nothing wrong with him physically. Psychologically, he showed signs of confusion and memory loss consistent with a dissociative episode, though doctors couldn't determine what had triggered it. Russo returned to duty 2 weeks later. He requested a transfer to a different barracks. The request was approved without question. 6 months later, he resigned from the state police. He now works in private security and has never publicly discussed what happened that night. But a fellow trooper who was close to Russo shared something with me that Russo had told him in confidence. While he was in the woods, Russo said he saw figures moving between the trees. Lots of them. They were dressed in old clothing, some in what looked like military uniforms from centuries ago. They were speaking in a language he didn't understand, and they were all looking at him. Tony said it was like he'd stepped through a door into another time, the trooper told me. He said the forest didn't look the same, the highway was gone, everything was different, and then suddenly he was back, standing at the edge of the woods, and I was calling his name. September 2007. Multiple drivers on the same night reported seeing police lights deep in the woods near mile marker 79. They said the lights were flashing, the characteristic pattern of police emergency lights, but the cruiser appeared to be far from any access road, impossibly far into the forest. State police responded to investigate. 7 units converged on the area. They searched for over an hour using high-powered lights and thermal imaging. They found no cruiser, no tire tracks, no path that would allow a vehicle to reach the location where witnesses had seen the lights. But witnesses kept calling. Different drivers on different nights, all reporting the same thing. Emergency lights flashing deep in the woods near mile marker 80. Lights that couldn't be there, that shouldn't be there, but that dozens of people swore they'd seen. One witness, a long-distance truck driver with 30 years of experience, was so insistent that he pulled off at the next exit and drove back to show police exactly where he'd seen the lights. He led them to a spot in the forest where, he insisted, he'd clearly seen flashing lights not 20 minutes earlier. The police searched. Nothing. The trucker was baffled. "I know what I saw," he told them. "I've seen police lights 1,000 times. Those were police lights, and they were right there in those woods." December 2015, just 3 months before Thomas Clardy died, a late-night motorist named Kevin Torres was driving eastbound on the Turnpike, heading home to Worcester after working a late shift. It was 12:35 in the morning. He was tired, listening to music, thinking about the bed waiting for him at home. As he approached mile marker 80, his headlights caught something in the road ahead. A man standing in the center lane. Kevin's foot slammed on the brake. His car skidded to a stop just feet from the figure. The man was wearing a state police uniform. He was standing perfectly still, facing Kevin's car. Even from inside his vehicle, Kevin could see that something was wrong. The man's posture was too rigid, too still. No human being stands that motionless. Kevin's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. "There's a man in the road," Kevin said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He's wearing a police uniform. I think he might be hurt or something. I'm at mile marker 80 eastbound." "Is he moving?" the dispatcher asked. Kevin looked up at the figure. "No, he's just standing there. He hasn't moved at all." "Stay in your vehicle, sir. Units are on the way." Kevin kept his eyes on the figure while he waited for help. The man didn't move, didn't wave, didn't show any sign of needing assistance or acknowledgement that Kevin was there. He just stood in the headlight beams, perfectly motionless. Then, still watching, Kevin saw the man's head begin to turn. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the figure's head rotated to face him directly. And even from 30 feet away, Kevin could see that the man was smiling. Not a normal smile, not a friendly expression. Something wrong with the shape of it, the way the mouth curved too wide, too sharp. Kevin's blood went cold. He threw the car in reverse and backed up, heart pounding. He kept his eyes on the figure the whole time. When state police arrived 7 minutes later, the figure was gone. Officers searched the area thoroughly. They found no one, no footprints, no indication anyone had been standing in the road. Kevin was adamant about what he'd seen. He described the uniform in detail, the exact shade of blue, the patches, the badge. He wasn't making it up. He wasn't confused. He'd seen something. The officer who took his statement filed a report but couldn't offer any explanation. One detail stood out. Kevin said the figure had been smiling. Most of the other witnesses who'd reported seeing figures near mile marker 80 over the years had mentioned the same thing, that wrong smile. 3 months later, Thomas Clardy was killed at mile marker 80 at 11:52 in the morning, and everything that had been bubbling beneath the surface, all the incidents and disappearances and strange sightings that had been dismissed or explained away, suddenly demanded attention. The first responders who arrived at Clardy's accident scene experienced something that none of them had encountered in all their years of service. Lieutenant James O'Connell was one of the first state police supervisors on scene. He'd worked hundreds of fatal accidents in his 25-year career. He'd seen terrible things. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to focus on the job, to process the trauma later. But Clardy's accident scene felt different from the moment he arrived. "The air felt wrong," O'Connell told me in an interview. "I know that sounds strange, but it's the only way I can describe it. It felt heavy, oppressive, like the atmosphere had weight. Several of the guys mentioned it too. We all felt it. Multiple first responders reported a sense of dread that was difficult to explain. One firefighter, a veteran with 18 years on the job, said, "I've worked accidents where people were decapitated, where bodies were torn apart. This wasn't even the most gruesome scene I'd worked that month, but I kept feeling like I wanted to leave, like something was telling me to get away from there." Then there were the equipment failures. In modern emergency response, technology is everywhere. Radios, cameras, cell phones, tablets, GPS units. At Clardy's accident scene, all of it started malfunctioning. Radios filled with static. Communications kept cutting out. Responders would key their radios to speak and get nothing but dead air or white noise. Dispatch had to relay messages through multiple units to get information through. Cameras refused to focus properly. One of the State Police accident reconstruction specialists was trying to photograph the scene for the investigation. His camera, a professional-grade DSLR that he'd used reliably for 3 years, kept producing blurry images. He checked the settings multiple times, cleaned the lens, tried different angles and lighting. Nothing worked. The images remained out of focus, as if something was preventing the camera from capturing clear pictures. Cell phones behaved strangely. Multiple responders reported their phones draining from full battery to dead in a matter of minutes. One paramedic's phone went from 87% battery to 0 in less than 10 minutes. It was a new phone, less than a month old, with no history of battery problems. Most unsettling was the temperature. Multiple responders mentioned it in their individual statements. The temperature around the immediate crash site, where Clardy's cruiser had been struck, was noticeably colder than the surrounding area. It was March, not particularly warm, but the temperature that day was in the mid-50s. Yet at the exact point of impact, thermometers registered temperatures in the low 40s. A temperature differential of 10 to 15 degrees, with no apparent cause. One of the firefighters, trying to explain this to investigators later, said, "It was like standing next to an open refrigerator. You'd take 2 steps away from that spot and it was normal temperature. 2 steps back and you'd feel this cold. Not like a breeze, like the cold was coming from the ground itself. These details never made it into official reports. They were just experiences, odd observations that first responders shared among themselves afterward. Nobody wanted to sound irrational or superstitious. Nobody wanted to suggest that something supernatural had occurred at a fatal accident scene. But they all knew something had been wrong. They all felt it. June 2016, 3 months after Clardy's death. A Massachusetts Department of Transportation maintenance crew was assigned to overnight road work near mile marker 80. They needed to repair some deteriorating asphalt, patch a few areas where the road surface had cracked. Routine work, the kind they did dozens of times every summer. The crew consisted of 6 men, all experienced workers who'd done this job for years. They set up their work zone around 11 p.m, positioned their equipment, established their traffic control pattern, and got to work. At 2:30 in the morning, during a break, one of the workers noticed a police cruiser pulling up behind their work zone. This wasn't unusual. State police regularly checked on overnight work crews, making sure they were safe and that traffic control was adequate. The worker waved to acknowledge the cruiser but noticed that no officer got out. The cruiser just sat there, engine presumably running, lights off. After about 5 minutes, the crew supervisor, a man named Tony Morales, walked over to check if everything was okay. As he approached, Tony could see through the windshield. The cruiser was empty. No officer inside. He walked around the vehicle, checking the doors. Locked. The engine was off. It was completely empty. Confused, Tony turned to wave at his crew, planning to ask if anyone had seen where the officer went. Behind him, he heard the cruiser's emergency lights activate, the familiar whoop of the siren chirping once. He spun around. The cruiser was gone. Just gone. The space where it had been parked seconds ago was empty. Tony stood there trying to process what had just happened. He walked back to his crew. "Did you guys see that?" he asked. All 5 of them had been watching. All 5 had seen the same thing. A police cruiser that had been there one moment and vanished the next. Not driven away, not moved, simply ceased to exist in that spot. 3 of the workers refused to continue working that night. They packed up their tools, got in their vehicles, and left. Tony didn't blame them. He finished the shift with the remaining 2 workers, but all 3 of them kept looking over their shoulders, expecting to see the cruiser reappear. The next day, Tony filed a report with his supervisor. He detailed exactly what had happened, knowing how insane it sounded. His supervisor listened, made some notes, and then quietly told Tony that his crew would be reassigned to a different section of the Turnpike for the rest of the summer. The 3 workers who'd quit were replaced, but the story spread among the MassDOT crews. Mile marker 80 became known as a place to avoid if possible. Workers who were assigned jobs in that area would request reassignments. Some would call in sick rather than work there. October 2016. Greg and Amanda Walsh were driving home to Worcester after visiting Amanda's parents in Springfield. It was late, close to midnight. Amanda was asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted from the visit. Greg was driving, fighting his own fatigue, looking forward to his bed. Near mile marker 79, Greg glanced in his rearview mirror, just a routine check of the traffic behind him. He saw someone sitting in the back seat of his car, a man in a state police uniform. Greg's heart nearly stopped. He jerked in his seat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. How was there someone in his back seat? The car had been locked. They hadn't stopped. They hadn't picked anyone up. This was impossible. He looked directly at the back seat, turning his head to see. Empty. No one there. Shaken, thinking he must have been seeing things, fatigue playing tricks on his mind, Greg looked back at the road, but his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, sitting calmly in the back seat, clearly visible in the reflection. And the face was wrong. The features didn't quite align properly, as if someone had tried to assemble a human face, but got the proportions slightly off. Greg's breath came in short gasps. He looked directly at the back seat again, still empty, back to the mirror. The figure remained, and now it seemed to be leaning forward slightly, as if trying to get closer to the front seats. Greg made a decision. He floored the accelerator. His Subaru leapt forward, the speedometer climbing quickly. He didn't care about speeding tickets. He just needed to get away from there, away from mile marker 80, away from whatever was in his car that couldn't be there but was. He drove at 85 miles per hour all the way to Worcester, weaving through traffic, not slowing down until he was pulling into his own driveway. Amanda woke up as he brought the car to an abrupt stop. "What's wrong?" she asked, seeing the fear on his face. Greg couldn't explain it right away. He got out of the car, opened the back door, checked the back seat thoroughly. Nothing there. He checked the locks, all secured. There was no way anyone could have gotten into their car. Later that week, he reviewed the footage from their dash cam, hoping it would show something that would explain what he'd experienced. The video showed the interior of the car reflected in the rearview mirror. The back seat appeared empty in the footage, but when he turned up the volume and listened carefully to the audio, he heard something that made his skin crawl. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing that didn't match the rhythm of either him or Amanda. A third set of breathing, coming from somewhere in the back seat. Greg had the audio analysed by a sound engineer friend. The engineer confirmed that there were definitely 3 distinct breathing patterns on the recording. He couldn't explain it. There had only been 2 people in the car, but the audio clearly captured a third. Greg and Amanda never drove through Charlton again. They'd add an hour to their trip to take an alternate route, anything to avoid that stretch of the Turnpike. March 16th, 2017. 1 year exactly after Thomas Clardy's death. His widow Racer and their 6 children made the difficult decision to visit the site where he died. They wanted to mark the anniversary, to honour his memory, to feel close to him one more time. It was a small, private gathering, just the immediate family. They'd brought flowers and a photo of Thomas in his uniform. They arranged these items near the shoulder where his cruiser had been struck. At 11:47 in the morning, the exact time of the accident, they stood together and prayed. The children held hands. Racer fought back tears, trying to be strong for them. That's when it happened. Racer felt a hand gently touch her shoulder. It was a familiar touch, the kind of gentle reassurance Thomas used to give her, the kind that said, "I'm here, everything will be okay." She turned quickly, expecting to see one of her children trying to comfort her. No one was behind her. All 6 children were standing together in front of her, several feet away. None of them had moved. Racer stood there, confused. She'd felt it so clearly. A hand on her shoulder. Thomas's hand. She'd recognized the touch immediately. Later, when they were back in the car heading home, all 6 children told their mother something that made her cry. They'd all felt their father's presence during the prayer. Not something vague or imagined. Something real and unmistakable. Lily, the oldest at 17, said, "I know Dad was there, Mum. I could smell his cologne, the one he wore to work every day. I know it sounds crazy, but I smelled it so clearly. He was there with us." Tyler, 15, agreed. "I felt like he was standing right next to me. I almost turned to look at him. It was that real." The younger children all reported similar experiences. They'd felt their father's presence. They'd felt him trying to communicate with them, trying to let them know he was okay. Racer didn't know what to make of it. She was a religious woman, believed in heaven and the afterlife. But this felt like more than faith. This felt like Thomas had actually been there, had somehow crossed the boundary between worlds to be with his family on the anniversary of his death. She never spoke about it publicly. It felt too personal, too sacred. But she knew in her heart that Thomas had been there at mile marker 80, waiting for them, and that whatever had happened to him, some part of him remained tied to that place. In 2018, retired detective Frank Morrison began what would become a 4-year obsession with mile marker 80. Morrison had spent 30 years with the Massachusetts State Police, working everything from drug trafficking to organized crime to cold cases. He'd retired in 2015, planning to spend his time fishing and enjoying his grandchildren. But he couldn't stop thinking about the Clardy case. Something about it bothered him. Not the legal aspects, that was settled, but the location, the circumstances, the strange reports that had circulated among first responders. Morrison started digging. He filed Freedom of Information requests for accident reports. He searched archived news articles. He interviewed retired officers who'd worked the Charlton area over the decades. He spoke with local historians about the area's history before the highway was built. What he found was disturbing. Mile marker 80 wasn't just the site of one tragedy. It was the epicenter of decades of inexplicable incidents. Morrison created a spreadsheet, meticulously documenting every incident he could verify. By the time he finished, the list was staggering. 37 accidents with no clear mechanical or medical cause. 8 people who had disappeared from or near this location, some never found. 127 official reports filed with state police about suspicious activity or unexplained phenomena in this specific area. He plotted the incidents on a timeline. The pattern was undeniable. Activity occurred year-round but spiked significantly in March. Every March, without fail, the number of incidents would increase. March, the month when the massacre had occurred in 1676, the month when Thomas Clardy had been killed in 2016. Morrison reached out to Dr. Patricia Devereaux, a folklorist and paranormal researcher at Boston University. He'd worked with her before on a cold case involving a supposedly haunted house where a murder had occurred. She was academic, rigorous, not given to wild speculation. If anyone could offer a rational perspective on this, it was her. Dr. Devereaux reviewed Morrison's data over several weeks. When they finally met to discuss her findings, her analysis was both scholarly and chilling. "What you're describing is consistent with what we call spiritual displacement," she explained. "It occurs when violent death happens on land that already holds spiritual significance. Think of it as layers of trauma building up over time." She pulled up a map on her laptop. The location of mile marker 80 is significant for several reasons. First, it sits very close to what the Nipmuc considered a thin place, a location where the barrier between the physical world and the spirit world is permeable. These places exist all over the world, recognized by different cultures throughout history. She zoomed in on the map. Second, this was the site of a massacre in 1676. Between 40 and 60 people died violently in this immediate area. Their remains were never properly buried or honored. In many spiritual traditions, this kind of desecration prevents souls from moving on. Third, she continued, the highway construction in the 1950s disturbed additional burial sites. We're not just talking about the massacre victims. The Nipmuc used this area for burial and ceremony for centuries before that. The construction crews literally paved over sacred ground. Dr. Devereaux pulled up another document. And finally, you have the modern tragedies. Each violent death that occurs at a location like this acts as an amplifier. It feeds energy into what's already there. Daniel Hayes disappearing in 1989, Thomas Clardy dying in 2016. These aren't just adding to a list of incidents. They're strengthening whatever force exists at this location. Morrison asked the question that had been bothering him. So, what does that mean? Are we talking about ghosts? Some kind of curse? Both, potentially, Dr. Devereaux said. The Nipmuc curse placed by the medicine woman Neshoba may have been real, in the sense that it was a focused intention directed at a specific place. Whether you believe in the supernatural power of such rituals or not, the intention itself matters. It shapes how people interact with the location, how they perceive it. She leaned forward. But more than that, you have the actual spirits of those who died there. In cultures that practice proper burial rites and death ceremonies, there's a reason for those traditions. They're meant to help the deceased transition, to release them from their attachment to the physical world. When those rites aren't performed, especially when death is violent and sudden, the spirit can become trapped. So, mile marker 80 is a trap? Morrison asked. In a sense, yes. It's become a place where the boundary between worlds is so thin that spirits can't distinguish between here and wherever they're supposed to go next. They're stuck in a kind of limbo, reliving their final moments, reaching out to the living in confusion or anger or desperation. Morrison felt a chill. And the living people who disappeared? Hayes and the others? Dr. Devereaux was quiet for a moment. That's harder to explain rationally. If we accept the premise that this is a thin place, a boundary area, then it's possible that living people can be pulled through under certain circumstances, especially if they're in a heightened emotional state, or if they're somehow resonant with the energy of the place. What would happen to them? Morrison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. I can't say for certain. They might exist in some kind of liminal space caught between worlds, or they might have crossed fully to the other side, becoming part of the spiritual landscape that exists parallel to our own. Some traditions believe that people taken by thin places become guardians or prisoners, depending on the nature of the place itself. Morrison left that meeting with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Mile marker 80 was far more than just an accident-prone stretch of highway. It was a location where the laws of nature seemed to operate differently, where the past refused to stay buried, where the dead and the living existed in uncomfortable proximity. He spent the next year documenting everything he could find. He interviewed more witnesses, many of whom had never officially reported their experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. Cold spots, equipment failures, figures in the woods, a sense of being watched, the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with that location. Morrison compiled everything into a detailed report, over 200 pages of documentation, witness statements, historical research, and analysis. He wasn't sure what to do with it. The official channels would dismiss it, the media would sensationalize it, so he kept it private, sharing it only with a few trusted colleagues and researchers. But his conclusion was inescapable. Mile marker 80 was cursed. It had been cursed for over 300 years, and every attempt to ignore or pave over that curse had only made it stronger. The incidents continued, and they were escalating. January 2019. A truck driver named Bill Henderson was making a late-night run eastbound on the Turnpike. It was 3:17 in the morning, and he'd been driving for about 6 hours. He was tired but alert, keeping his speed steady, his eyes on the road ahead. His dashcam was running, as it always did, a safety precaution that had saved him from several false insurance claims over the years. The camera captured everything: the empty highway ahead, the darkness of the forest on either side, the occasional passing vehicle going westbound. Then near mile marker 79, the headlights caught something crossing the road. Bill's first thought was that it was a deer. But as his brain processed what he was seeing, he realized it was much bigger than a deer, and it was walking upright. The figure was tall, around 7 feet, moving across all lanes of the highway from the tree line on the right toward the tree line on the left. It walked with a strange, unnatural gait, as if its joints didn't quite work the way human joints should. Its limbs seemed too long, its movements too fluid. Bill slowed down, his heart rate climbing. The figure reached the center of the highway and then, still moving at the same steady pace, turned its head to face the truck. That's when Bill saw that where the face should be, There was only shadow. Not a person wearing a mask. Not someone in darkness. Just pure shadow, as if the concept of a face simply didn't exist on this thing. The figure was wearing what appeared to be a dark uniform, though the details were hard to make out in the headlights. It stood there for a moment, its featureless face pointed directly at Bill's truck. Then it continued walking, disappearing into the trees on the left side of the highway. Bill pulled over, breathing hard. He sat there for 10 minutes, trying to convince himself he'd imagined it. But he knew what he'd seen. He'd been driving trucks for 23 years. He knew the difference between reality and highway fatigue hallucinations. When he got to his destination in Boston, he reviewed his dash cam footage. The entire encounter was recorded in clear detail. The figure crossing the road, the unnatural movement, the moment it turned to face the camera. All of it was there. Bill uploaded the video to Reddit with a simple title. "What the hell did I just see on the Mass Pike?" The video went viral. Within 2 days, it had over 2 million views. The comments section exploded with theories. Hoax, CGI, clever editing. But professional video analysts examined the footage and found no evidence of manipulation. Skeptics remained skeptical, as they always do. But people who'd driven that stretch of highway, who'd experienced something similar, knew what they were looking at. Something existed at mile marker 80. Something that didn't belong in our world, but couldn't leave it. June 2020. It was a strange time in the world. The pandemic had changed everything. But state police still patrolled the highways, still responded to calls, still did the work that needed doing. On the night of June 23rd, State Police Dispatch received an unusual number of calls. 47 calls over the course of 6 hours, all reporting the same thing. Emergency lights deep in the woods near mile marker 80. Multiple callers described seeing red and blue flashing lights, the characteristic pattern of police emergency lights, far back in the forest where no vehicle should be able to reach. The lights were visible from the highway, flickering through the trees, unmistakably police lights. State police responded with multiple units. 7 cruisers converged on the area between mile markers 78 and 82. Troopers spread out, using high-powered flashlights and thermal imaging equipment to search the woods. They found nothing. No cruiser, no emergency lights. No evidence that any vehicle had been in the forest recently. The woods were empty, but the calls kept coming. Different drivers, different times throughout the night, all reporting the same thing. One trooper, a veteran named Lieutenant Diana Foster, decided to try something different. She positioned her cruiser on the shoulder and activated her own dash cam, pointing it toward the area where witnesses had reported seeing lights. She waited, engine idling, watching the tree line. At 2:47 a.m., her dash cam captured something extraordinary. Reflections of emergency lights appeared in the trees, flickering across the branches and trunks. The characteristic red and blue pattern was clearly visible, reflected as if from a light source deeper in the woods. Lieutenant Foster immediately grabbed her handheld spotlight and aimed it at the area where the reflection suggested a light source should be. Nothing. The woods were dark, no lights at all. But in her dashcam's footage, the reflections continued. The emergency lights were visible only in reflection, not in direct observation. It was as if they existed in some parallel space, visible only indirectly. Lieutenant Foster radioed the other units. "I'm seeing something here. It's showing up in reflections but not direct observation. This is unlike anything I've ever encountered." Other troopers positioned their vehicles and confirmed the same phenomenon. Their cameras picked up the reflections of emergency lights, but when they looked directly at where the source should be, the woods were dark. The lights continued for approximately 45 minutes. Then, at 3:32 a.m., they simply stopped. No fading, no gradual dimming. They just ceased to exist, and the forest returned to normal darkness. Lieutenant Foster's report was filed and quickly classified. The official explanation given to the media was that multiple drivers had been confused by reflections from a distant communication tower. But anyone who read the actual report, who saw the dashcam footage, knew that explanation made no sense. Halloween 2021. 3 paranormal investigators, a team that ran a somewhat popular YouTube channel, decided to conduct an investigation at mile marker 80. They knew it was illegal to park there, but they were willing to risk the citation for the content. They arrived at 10 p.m. on October 31st and set up their equipment just off the shoulder. EMF meters to detect electromagnetic fluctuations, thermal cameras to capture temperature changes, audio recorders to pick up any unexplained sounds. They were experienced, having investigated dozens of supposedly haunted locations over the past 5 years. But nothing had prepared them for mile marker 80. They wanted to be there at 11:47 p.m., the exact time of Thomas Clardy's death, 5 years after the tragedy. They believed that anniversary times held special significance in paranormal investigation. At 11:45 p.m., their equipment started showing unusual readings. The EMF meters, which had been registering normal background electromagnetic radiation, suddenly spiked. The needles maxed out, indicating fields far stronger than anything that should exist in a natural environment. One of the investigators, a woman named Ashley Monroe, noticed her breath becoming visible. She checked the thermometer. The temperature had been 52 degrees when they'd arrived. It was now 31 degrees. The temperature had dropped 21 degrees in less than 2 minutes. All 3 investigators reported feeling intense pressure, as if something heavy was pushing down on them from above. One described it as feeling like being underwater, pressure in his ears and chest, difficulty taking full breaths. At exactly 11:47 p.m., their audio recorder captured something that would later be analysed by multiple experts. A voice, speaking clearly, but in a language none of them recognised. The recording was brought to Dr. Elena Blackwood, a linguistics professor at the University of Massachusetts, who specialised in Native American languages. After careful analysis, she identified it as Nipmuc, a language that had been mostly lost by the early 1900s. Dr. Blackwood's translation sent chills through everyone who read it. "This ground is cursed, the debt is not paid, you walk where we fell, you breathe where we died, the debt is not paid." The investigators packed up their equipment and left. They posted about the experience on their channel, but didn't include the audio. It felt too real, too personal, too disturbing to share publicly. One of them, a man named Derek Foster, later told me, "I've investigated dozens of supposedly haunted places. Most of them are nothing. People's imaginations, environmental factors, that kind of thing. But mile marker 80 is different. Something is there. Something that doesn't want to be forgotten." March 16th, 2024, 8 years after Thomas Clardy's death. The anniversary had become significant not just to his family, but to others who'd lost loved ones on this stretch of highway over the years. Racer Clardy organised a small memorial service, inviting other families to join. About 30 people gathered at a spot near mile marker 80, far enough off the highway to be safe, but close enough to feel connected to where their loved ones had died. They'd brought flowers, photos, small mementos. They arranged these items carefully, creating a temporary memorial that honoured all who'd been lost here. At 11:47 a.m, they stood together and observed a moment of silence. The day was clear and calm. No wind, no clouds. Perfect spring weather. Then suddenly everyone felt it. A cold wind that seemed to come from nowhere, rushing past them with enough force to rustle clothing and hair. But the trees around them didn't move. The leaves didn't stir. The wind touched only the people standing at the memorial. Multiple people reported feeling watched, not by other humans, by something in the trees, something in the forest, something that had been there long before the highway and would remain long after. One witness, a woman named Patricia Moore, who'd lost her husband in an accident at mile marker 81 in 2009, had brought her camera. She'd taken dozens of photos during the memorial service. When she reviewed them later that evening, she found something that made her call Racer immediately. In several of the photos, dark figures were visible between the trees. They appeared to be standing at the edge of the forest, watching the memorial service. The figures were wearing uniforms, not modern uniforms, but various styles from different eras. One figure, standing slightly closer to the gathering than the others, matched Thomas Clardy's height and build. Patricia hadn't known Thomas, had never seen photos of him. But when she showed the picture to Racer, Racer's knees nearly buckled. "That's him," she whispered. "That's my Thomas." The figure in the photo was indistinct, more shadow than substance, but the proportions were right. The stance was right. The way he held himself was unmistakably Thomas. Racer had the photo analysed by several experts. None could explain how the figures appeared in multiple photos, but weren't visible to any of the 30 people who'd been present. None could definitively prove or disprove that they were genuine paranormal phenomena. But Racer believed. Thomas was still there, at mile marker 80. Whether by choice or by force, whether as guardian or prisoner, some part of him remained bound to that cursed stretch of highway. October 2024, just 2 months ago, State Police Trooper Michael O'Brien was on routine patrol. He was 32 years old, 6 years on the job, capable and professional. He'd heard the stories about mile marker 80, of course. Every trooper in the region had heard them, but he'd never experienced anything unusual himself, and he tended towards skepticism. That changed on the night of October 15th. O'Brien was conducting a patrol of the Charlton area around 1:30 in the morning. Light traffic, quiet night, everything routine. He was thinking about the end of his shift, about the breakfast he'd make when he got home. Then his radio crackled to life with a transmission that made his blood run cold. Unit 347, this is dispatch. Unit 347, Daniel Hayes' call sign. The trooper who'd vanished in 1989, 35 years ago. O'Brien grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 219. I'm getting some kind of interference on this channel. Dispatch responded immediately. Unit 219, we're not transmitting. Your radio shouldn't be receiving anything right now. What are you hearing? Before O'Brien could respond, the voice came through again, clear despite heavy static underneath. All units be advised, the road is not safe. They're still here. They're waiting. Don't stop at mile marker 80. Don't leave your vehicle. They're still here. O'Brien's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was approaching mile marker 79. The voice on the radio continued, words becoming harder to distinguish through the growing static. We're trapped here. Can't leave. Can't move on. The ground holds us. The curse holds us. Tell them to stay away. Tell them. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. O'Brien's heart was pounding. He glanced in his rearview mirror, just a routine check. Someone was sitting in his back seat, a man in a state police uniform. Not a modern uniform, but an older style, the kind worn in the late 1980s. The man was looking directly at O'Brien, meeting his eyes in the mirror. O'Brien slammed on the brakes. His cruiser skidded to a stop on the shoulder. He drew his weapon, spun around in his seat. The back seat was empty. No one there. Impossible. Breathing hard, O'Brien checked the back seat thoroughly, checked the locks, checked everywhere someone could hide. Nothing. He was alone in the cruiser. He looked back at his rearview mirror. The figure was still there, sitting calmly in the back seat, visible only in the reflection. And the face, though indistinct, looked familiar from the photos O'Brien had seen during his training. Daniel Hayes, the trooper who'd vanished 35 years ago. O'Brien called for backup. He tried to keep his voice steady, tried to sound professional, but he could hear the tremor in his own words. Unit 219 requesting backup at mile marker 79. I've got a situation here that I need assistance with. 2 units responded and arrived within 8 minutes. By then, the figure in O'Brien's mirror had vanished. He tried to explain what he'd experienced, but the words sounded insane even to him. His dash cam had recorded the entire incident. The audio of the radio transmission was crystal clear, and when the video showed O'Brien looking in his rearview mirror, something appeared in the footage of his back seat. The image was distorted, pixelated, as if the camera was struggling to process what it was recording. But something was definitely there. A digital forensics expert examined the footage. This shouldn't happen, he said. Modern police cameras are designed to handle all sorts of challenging conditions. But it's like something is interfering with the recording itself. Not a physical object, but something affecting how the digital sensor captures the image. He couldn't explain it. Neither could anyone else who reviewed the footage. O'Brien requested a transfer 2 weeks later. The request was approved without question, processed faster than transfers typically took. He's now assigned to a different troop patrolling a different section of highway. He refuses to drive through Charlton, even on his days off. In his transfer request, he wrote a brief statement that was added to his personnel file. I have seen things at mile marker 80 that I cannot explain and do not wish to experience again. For my own mental health and safety, I respectfully request reassignment away from this area." The request was approved without anyone asking what things he'd seen. I spoke with retired State Police Sergeant William De Silva to get a sense of what the rank and file actually believe about mile marker 80. De Silva worked the Charlton area for 15 years before retiring in 2020. He was willing to speak candidly on the condition that I made clear these were his personal views, not official state police policy. "Off the record," he said, though he knew I was recording. "We all know something's wrong with that stretch, has been for decades. I remember when I was a rookie in 2005, the first time I got assigned to patrol that area at night. The senior trooper I was riding with, guy named Tom Callahan, he pulled me aside before we went out." De Silva leaned back in his chair. Tom said, "Listen, I need to tell you something about the Charlton area. There's a section between markers 78 and 82 where strange things happen. I can't explain it. Nobody can. But if you have to stop there, keep your engine running, keep your doors locked, and don't leave your vehicle unless you absolutely have to. And whatever you do, don't go into the woods." I thought he was hazing me, trying to scare the rookie. But then I worked that area for a few weeks and I started to understand. Your equipment fails more often there. Your radio cuts out. You get feelings you can't explain, like you're being watched. You see things in your peripheral vision that vanish when you look directly at them. I asked him if he'd ever experienced anything directly. "Once," he said. "I was parked on the shoulder near marker 80, maybe 3 in the morning, just taking a break. I had this overwhelming urge to look in my back seat. No reason, just this sudden compulsion. So I turned around and looked. Nothing there. But when I looked back at my mirror, I swear I saw someone, just for a second. Then it was gone." He paused. "After Hayes vanished, after Clardy was killed, Command implemented quiet protocols. Nothing official, nothing in writing. Just unwritten rules passed down from senior troopers to junior ones. No single officer patrols there after 10 p.m. if it can be avoided. Radio check-ins every 10 minutes in that zone, way more frequent than anywhere else. If you respond to a call there, you wait for backup before doing anything. Why doesn't the state police acknowledge this officially?" I asked. De Silva laughed, but there was no humour in it. "How? How do you officially acknowledge something like this? How do you tell the public that we believe a section of highway is genuinely haunted? The media would have a field day. We'd lose credibility. People would think we were insane." "But people keep dying there," I said. "I know," De Silva responded quietly. "Believe me, I know, and that's the tragedy. We can't protect people from something we can't admit exists. All we can do is implement our quiet protocols and hope that whatever's there doesn't reach out too often." I asked him what he thought was actually at mile marker 80. "I don't know," he said. "I'm not a spiritual person. I'm not religious. I believe in what I can see and touch and prove, but something is there. Whether it's ghosts or some kind of energy or a curse or something we don't have words for yet, I don't know. But it's real, and it's dangerous. The statistics tell a story that official reports won't acknowledge. Between 2016 and 2024, the 3-mile stretch between markers 78 and 82 has seen 23 accidents with unknown causes. Drivers crossing multiple lanes without explanation. Single vehicle crashes with no medical or mechanical factors. Accidents that simply shouldn't have happened but did. Equipment malfunctions occur at rates far above comparable sections of highway. Police radios fail. Cameras stop working. Cell phones drain inexplicably. State police vehicles assigned to patrol this area require maintenance more frequently than vehicles working other sections, despite comparable mileage and conditions. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation has resurfaced this section 4 times in 8 years, more than any other comparable stretch in the state. The official reason given is routine maintenance and high traffic volume, but the real reason, whispered among road crews, is the cold spots that appear in the asphalt. Workers report areas of the road surface that are consistently 15 to 20 degrees colder than surrounding sections, dark stains that appear overnight, stains that can't be cleaned or covered no matter how many layers of fresh asphalt they apply. One crew supervisor told me that the stains almost look like burn marks but reversed, like something cold burned them into the asphalt. The stains appear most frequently in March, the anniversary month. I reached out to David Njuguna, the man who killed Thomas Clardy, hoping to get his perspective on what happened that day. He declined to speak on camera or on the record. His attorney sent a cease and desist letter warning me not to contact him again. But before the lawyer got involved, Njuguna sent me a brief written statement. He didn't sign it, but it came from his email address. "I see that road in my nightmares," the statement read. "Every night since the accident, I see mile marker 80. I see a figure standing on the shoulder wearing a dark uniform. He's gesturing to me, waving me over like he wants me to follow him. And in the dream, I can't control the car. It just crosses the lanes heading right for him, right for where the trooper was stopped. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I don't expect forgiveness. I killed a good man. I destroyed a family. I deserve everything I got, and more. But I'm telling the truth when I say something made me do it. I felt like I wasn't in control anymore. Everything went dark, like a curtain dropping over my vision, and then there was the crash. I would never hurt anyone intentionally. I'm not a violent person. I'm not a reckless person. But something at mile marker 80 wanted me to crash, wanted me to kill, and I couldn't stop it. I don't drive anymore. I can't. Every time I get behind a wheel, I see that figure. I hear that voice in my head telling me to follow, to join them, to become part of whatever's waiting there. So I take the bus. I walk. I do anything but drive. The trooper's family deserves better than 6 years. They deserve their husband and father back, but I can't give them that. All I can say is that I'm sorry, and that something evil lives at mile marker 80, something that's been there long before me and will be there long after I'm gone. The statement raised more questions than it answered, but it aligned with what many others had reported, the feeling of being controlled, of being pulled toward that location, of seeing figures that gestured and beckoned. What debt did the voice in the Nipmuc language reference? What was still owed? The lives taken during the massacre in 1676, the desecration of burial grounds in 1956, or something older, something that predated even the Nipmuc presence in these lands? I reached out to James Strongbow again, hoping he could shed light on Nipmuc beliefs about debt and curses. In our tradition, he explained, there's a concept of balance. When something is taken, something must be given. When violence is done, it must be answered. Not revenge exactly, but restoration of balance. When the warriors were killed in 1676 and left unburied, that created an imbalance. Their spirits couldn't move on, couldn't complete their journey. That imbalance affected the land itself, made it sick in a sense. Then the burial grounds were disturbed again in the 1950s. More imbalance, more disruption. The curse that Neshoba placed wasn't about punishment. It was about protecting the dead, ensuring that those who disturbed them would understand the cost. I asked him what would be required to restore balance, since he was quiet for a long time. I don't know if it can be restored at this point. Too much time has passed. Too much violence has accumulated. The land has absorbed so much death, so much pain, that I'm not sure any ceremony could cleanse it now. But, he continued, if it were to be attempted, it would require several things. First, proper burial rites for all the remains that were disturbed or never properly interred. Second, acknowledgement from the government, from the state, of what was done and the harm it caused. Third, a ceremony of release performed by tribal elders, asking the spirits to forgive and move on. Will that happen? I asked. No, he said simply. The state won't acknowledge a curse. They can't. And even if they wanted to, where would we begin? We don't know where all the remains are. We don't know how many burial sites were destroyed. We don't even know the names of most of the warriors who died there. So the curse continues, I said. The curse continues, he agreed, and the dead wait, and people keep dying, and nothing changes. Frank Morrison, the retired detective who spent 4 years researching this case, offered his final assessment when I interviewed him in November 2024. I've spent my entire career dealing with things I could understand, Morrison said. Murders, I could understand. Drugs, corruption, organised crime. All of it made sense within a framework of human behaviour and motivation. But mile marker 80 doesn't fit any framework I know. I've reviewed hundreds of documents. I've interviewed dozens of witnesses. I've stood at that spot at midnight, trying to feel whatever people describe. And here's what I know for certain. Something is at mile marker 80. Something that doesn't want to be forgotten. Something that reaches out and affects the living. Whether it's the spirits of warriors who died in 1676, or Trooper Hayes, or Trooper Clardy, or all of them together, I can't say. Maybe it's something even older, something that was there before the Nipmuc, something that humans have different names for but have always feared. He looked at me directly. But that ground is cursed. It's claimed too many lives, and I don't think it's done. I think it will keep claiming lives until someone finds a way to break the curse, or until the highway itself is removed and the land is returned to what it was. Will that happen? I asked, echoing my question to James Strongbow. No, Morrison said. The Turnpike is too important. Too much commerce flows through there. Too many people depend on it. So we'll keep patching the cold spots in the asphalt. We'll keep implementing quiet protocols. We'll keep warning each other without officially acknowledging what we're warning against. And people will keep dying. He paused. And somewhere, on land that has been soaked in blood for 300 years, the dead will keep waiting, because that's all they can do now. Wait, and reach out and hope that someone finally hears them. Thomas Clardy was a hero, a Marine who served his country with honour, a trooper who served his community with dedication, a father who loved his children more than anything in the world, a husband who made his wife laugh even on difficult days, a man who deserved to live a long life, to see his children grow up, to meet his grandchildren, to retire and enjoy the fruits of a life well lived. Instead, he died on a clear Wednesday afternoon at 11:52 in the morning, struck by a vehicle on a stretch of highway that has been cursed for over 300 years. His death was ruled an accident, caused by a reckless, impaired driver. And maybe that's all it was. Maybe David Njuguna really was just high and driving recklessly. Maybe his claim that something forced him to crash is just an attempt to avoid responsibility. Maybe all the other incidents, the disappearances and sightings and equipment failures, are just coincidences. Maybe mile marker 80 is just a road. Maybe the cold spots in the asphalt have a rational explanation. Maybe the voices speaking Nipmuc in the middle of the night are auditory hallucinations. Maybe the figures in the woods are just shadows and imagination. Maybe there's a reasonable explanation for everything, and the curse is just a story, and the dead are just dead, and nothing remains but memory. But I don't think so. I've spent 6 months investigating this story. I've interviewed dozens of people. I've reviewed hundreds of documents. I've stood at mile marker 80 at midnight, and I've felt what everyone describes. That sense of wrongness, that feeling of being watched, that cold that has no source but feels real nonetheless. Something is there. Something that was there before the highway and will be there long after the highway crumbles. Something that remembers the violence of 1676, that remembers the warriors whose bodies were left to rot, that remembers the medicine woman's curse and the burial grounds disturbed, and all the deaths that have accumulated like layers of sediment. The dead don't rest at mile marker 80. They can't. They're trapped there, bound by violence and desecration, and a curse that has never been lifted. They reach out to the living because they don't know what else to do. They cause accidents because they're confused or angry or desperate or all three. And they wait. They've been waiting for over 300 years. They'll wait 300 more if that's what it takes. So if you find yourself driving the Massachusetts Turnpike late at night between Ludlow and Worcester, pay attention to the mile markers. When you see 78, stay alert. Keep both hands on the wheel. Don't look too long at your mirrors. Don't let your mind wander. Don't think about the forest on either side, about what might be watching from between the trees. And if you see emergency lights in the woods, or a figure standing on the shoulder, or if your radio picks up transmissions from units that vanished decades ago, don't stop. Don't investigate. Don't try to help. Just keep driving. Keep your foot steady on the accelerator and don't look back. Whatever's waiting there is patient. It's been patient for centuries. It can wait a little longer, and it will. It will wait for you, or for someone else, or for whoever happens to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, because at mile marker 80, time doesn't work the way it should. The past isn't really past, the dead aren't really dead, and the curse placed by a grieving medicine woman over 3 centuries ago is still very much alive. This has been Void Case Files. Hit that subscribe button. Let's reach 1,000 by New Year's. We're at 676, and we're posting daily videos. We're building something here, you and me, exploring the places where reality gets thin, where the explanations run out, where the only honest answer is, I don't know. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to Thomas Clardy's story and Daniel Hayes' story and all the others who've been touched by whatever haunts mile marker 80. Stay safe out there, watch your mirrors, trust your instincts, and remember, some roads are best travelled in daylight, with company, and with the understanding that not everything can be explained. On the Massachusetts Turnpike, between mile markers 78 and 82, the dead don't rest. They wait, and they're not alone anymore. Thomas Clardy is there now, along with Daniel Hayes, along with the warriors from 1676, along with everyone else who's been claimed by that cursed ground. They wait, they watch, and every March on the anniversary of the massacre and the anniversary of Clardy's death, they remember. They remember what was taken from them. They remember the debt that was never paid. They remember and they reach out, and sometimes they find someone. Don't let that someone be you. Drive safe, subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow with another case, another mystery, another place where the world doesn't work quite the way it should. Because the void is deep and it's watching, and it has stories to tell. Stories like this one, stories that blur the line between history and horror, between tragedy and curse, between the dead and the living. Mile marker 80 is waiting. It's always waiting, and now you know why. Good night.